Margaret Calloway stood frozen at her husband's grave. The Montana wind was a living thing, an angry spirit that clawed at her black mourning dress, trying to pull her down into the cold earth with him. She was only 26, but in the hard eyes of Silver Creek, she was ancient. They had a name for her, a name they whispered when she walked by, a name that stuck to her like mud. The Death Bride, 3 months a widow. Again. And she could feel their stares right now, burning into her back from the edge of the cemetery. Little sparks of hate in the gray afternoon. The year was 1878, and the frontier didn't have time for a woman's tears. It had even less time for a woman like Margaret. "You planning on standing there till you join him, Mrs. Calloway?" The voice was sharp, brittle. It belonged to Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, a woman who considered morality her own personal property. She stood with her arms crossed, a vulture in a bonnet. "Might be better for everyone if you did." Margaret's fingers, already numb from the cold, tightened around the single stubborn wildflower she'd brought for Thomas. 6 years. 6 years of marriage, of building a life from dust and dreams, all of it erased by the crack of falling timber in a silver mine. Now she was just a problem to be solved, a piece of bad luck walking on 2 legs. "I was just leaving," Margaret said. Her voice didn't shake. She wouldn't give them that. "Good," Mrs. Abernathy sniffed. "Decent folk don't need reminding of misfortune. And you, Mrs. Calloway, you are nothing but misfortune." Margaret had heard it all before. The whispers were as constant as the wind. Thomas was her second husband to die. Her second. The first was James. Barely a boy, really. They'd been married a month, their whole lives stretched out before them like a sunlit road. Then the fever came, hot and fast, and stole him away in the night. Now Thomas, crushed and broken, pulled from the darkness of the very mine that was supposed to make their fortune. 2 dead husbands before she'd seen 30. In a town like Silver Creek, that wasn't a tragedy. It was a pattern. It was a crime. And they were all just waiting for her to commit it again. The walk back to town was a parade of one. Her small cabin, the one Thomas had built with his own hands, sat on the edge of everything, an afterthought. Just like her. The mortgage was due. Mr. Abernathy had made that very clear. The bank didn't give credit to bad luck. As she hit Main Street, she kept her eyes on the dusty ground, but you couldn't unhear whispers. "There she goes, the Black Widow. Wonder which poor fool she'll set her sights on next, just to see him into an early grave." The men outside the saloon went quiet as she passed. A respectful silence, you might think. But it wasn't respect. It was the silence of a room when a rattlesnake slides through the door. All of them went silent. Except one. "Afternoon, Mrs. Calloway." The voice was deep, unfamiliar. It cut through the hate like a clean blade. Margaret looked up, startled, her shield of misery pierced. A tall man stood a little apart from the others. His hat was tipped, a simple gesture of respect so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. His clothes were worn from the trail, but they were clean. His boots were scuffed but cared for. He was a man who hadn't given up on himself, and that alone made him a strange sight in this town. She'd never seen him before. A drifter, maybe, passing through. "Afternoon," she managed, her voice tight. One of the local men, a sour-faced miner named Frank Hollister, spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dirt, dangerously close to her hem. "Better watch yourself, stranger," Frank sneered. "That one's husband ain't been in the ground 3 months. Second one, too. They say she's cursed." The stranger's eyes never left Margaret's face. They were blue. Not just blue, but a startling, piercing blue, the color of a mountain lake under a summer sky. And in them, she saw not pity, not suspicion, but something else, curiosity. "Is that so?" he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried over the jeers. He looked from Frank back to Margaret. "Then I reckon the only appropriate thing to say is, 'I honor your loss, madam.'" The street went absolutely still. The silence this time was different. It was the silence of shock, of disbelief. Margaret felt a strange tightness in her chest. It was a feeling so old she'd almost forgotten its name: gratitude. Someone had seen her grief, her actual grief, not the town's ugly story about it. "Thank you, Mr. Ramsey. Reed Ramsey." He touched the brim of his hat again. "Just passing through. On my way north." Before she could say more, Sheriff Doyle lumbered out of his office. "Mrs. Calloway, the bank's looking for you. Something about that payment being late." Again. Margaret pulled her shoulders back. The brief moment of warmth was gone, replaced by the familiar chill of her reality. "I'm aware, Sheriff. I'll handle it." "See that you do," the sheriff grumbled. "This town's got enough problems without having to figure out what to do with you if you lose that place." She turned to go, the weight of it all settling back on her. But Reed Ramsey's voice stopped her, one last time. "Madam, I'm looking for some work while I'm in town. Any repairs need doing on that place of yours?" Frank Hollister let out a loud, ugly laugh. "She can't afford to feed herself, let alone pay for help." Margaret should have kept walking. She should have ignored the stranger, ignored Frank, ignored all of it, and retreated to her empty, lonely cabin. But she didn't. She turned back, a spark of defiance she thought had died long ago flaring to life. "Actually, Mr. Ramsey," she said, her voice clear and steady, "my roof has a leak. Needs patching." She looked straight at Frank, then back to the stranger. "I can't pay much, but I can offer a hot meal for your trouble." She saw the surprise in Reed Ramsey's blue eyes, but he masked it quickly. "That would be more than fair, madam." As she walked toward the bank, she didn't look back, but she could feel every eye on Main Street drilling into her. She had just invited a strange man to her home, a man she'd known for all of 5 minutes. No respectable widow would ever do such a thing. But they'd already decided she wasn't respectable. So what more did she have to lose? The meeting with Mr. Abernathy was exactly as grim as she'd expected. He sat behind his big desk, a small man made large by money and judgment. He told her she had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to come up with the payment, or the bank would begin foreclosure. "Perhaps you should consider selling, Mrs. Calloway," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "This town, well, it holds painful memories for you, I'm sure." What he meant was, "This town doesn't want you. Get out." "I'll have your payment, Mr. Abernathy." "And how?" he asked, leaning back. "Do you propose to manage that? The bit of sewing you do barely covers your food." Margaret stood up, her back straight. "I'll find a way," she said, her voice a promise to herself more than to him. "I always do." When she got back to the cabin, Reed Ramsey was already there. He was circling the small house, his gaze fixed on the roof. He had a horse now, a strong chestnut that was calmly eating the sparse grass nearby. He hadn't just been waiting, he'd been preparing. "Hope you don't mind I came on ahead," he said as she walked up. "Didn't want to lose the daylight." "No, that's fine." She hesitated, the reality of what she'd done suddenly hitting her. A strange man, at her home, alone. "Mr. Ramsey, I should tell you, inviting you here, it might cause talk." She had to add, "More talk, I should say." Reed's expression didn't change. His blue eyes were steady. "Mrs. Calloway, I've never put much stock in gossip. Your roof needs fixing. I need a day's work. Seems simple enough to me." For the first time in months, a real smile, small and fragile, touched Margaret's lips. It felt like a foreign muscle. "In that case," she said, "let me show you where it's leaking." As Reed climbed onto the roof, his movements sure and economical, Margaret went inside to prepare a meal. It was just beans and cornbread, with the very last of her salt pork. Not much of a payment, but as she worked, Stirring the beans, mixing the cornmeal, she felt a flicker of something new. Purpose. She was cooking for someone other than herself. The simple act felt revolutionary. When Reed came down as the sun began to dip, he washed his face and hands in the basin outside. He took off his hat before stepping through the door, revealing thick, dark hair with a slight curl. He moved with an easy grace, a man who was comfortable wherever he stood. "Roof's patched," he said. "Should hold through the next few rains at least." "Thank you," she said. "Please sit." They ate in silence for a few minutes. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was calm, a strange peace in the little cabin that had only known grief for so long. "How long you been in Silver Creek, Mrs. Calloway?" Reed asked finally. 3 years. We came out from Pennsylvania. Thomas heard about the silver strike." She poked at her beans. "And you? Where are you headed?" "Montana Territory. Got family up that way." He took a bite of cornbread and chewed thoughtfully. "This is mighty good." "It's just cornbread." "Made well is what it is," he said. He looked at her then, a direct, assessing gaze. "Those folks in town, they give you a hard time often?" Margaret put her fork down. "Mr. Ramsey? Reed, please." "Reed, then. I appreciate your kindness, but you don't need to concern yourself with my situation. I'll manage." He nodded slowly, accepting her words, but not entirely. "I have no doubt you will, but that doesn't make it right, the way they treat you." He paused. "People fear what they don't understand, and death, well, most folks prefer to keep it at a distance, and you've seen too much of it up close." His words were so simple, so true, they almost made her want to weep. He saw it. He actually saw it. After dinner, he wouldn't take any coffee. "Best be getting back to town before it's full dark," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "Thank you for the meal." He stood in the open doorway, a tall silhouette against the fading purple light. He hesitated. "Mrs. Calloway, I noticed your garden plot. It hasn't been turned for spring planting yet. I haven't had the time, or the strength for it," she admitted. It was another failure, another sign of her slow decline. "I could help with that too if you're amenable. Day after tomorrow, perhaps?" Every instinct screamed at her to say no. A widow, living alone, inviting a man, a stranger, back to her home. Not once, but twice. It was reckless. It was madness. But the garden needed planting. She needed the vegetables to survive the next winter, and the work was too much for her alone. "That would be kind of you," she found herself saying. "I can pay with another meal." Reed smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached his startling blue eyes and transformed his whole face. "Deal." After he was gone, a shadow swallowed by the night, Margaret sat in her quiet cabin, but for the first time in a very long time, the silence didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a possibility. But Reed Ramsey wasn't just a kind stranger. He was in Silver Creek for a reason, and that reason had everything to do with Margaret. 2 days later, Reed returned. He was there before the sun had fully risen, a dark shape moving with purpose in the pale morning light. He wasn't empty-handed. He carried a small sack, and from it, he produced 2 smaller bundles, seed potatoes and a packet of beans. "Thought these might help get your garden started," he said. He didn't make a show of it. He just offered them, a simple gift. "Thank you," Margaret said, surprised by his thoughtfulness. That's very generous." They worked side by side all morning. The earth was hard and unforgiving, but Reed's strength made the work go fast. He turned the soil with a steady rhythm, his muscles moving under his shirt. He showed her the right depth to plant the potatoes, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle with the fragile seeds. "You're good at this," she said, watching him. "Grew up on a farm in Tennessee," he explained, not looking up. Left when I was 18, but some things you don't forget. Why did you leave? The question was out before she could stop it. It was too personal. Reed's hand stilled for just a second. Then he resumed digging. War came. When it was over, home didn't feel like home anymore. The war. It had ended 13 years ago, but for men like him, and for men like Thomas, it had never really ended. The ghosts of it were still marching. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Nothing to be sorry for, he said, his voice flat. Found I preferred the open country anyway. But as he worked, Margaret noticed something. He wasn't just turning soil. His eyes were constantly scanning. He looked at the cabin, at the small shed out back, at the woods beyond the clearing. He wasn't just helping her with her garden. He was casing the place. The thought sent a shiver of ice through her veins. Was his kindness a lie? A performance? As the sun climbed higher, it grew brutally hot. Reed took off his outer shirt, working in the thin undershirt that soon clung to his broad back and shoulders. Margaret tried not to stare, but it had been so long since she'd been this close to a man, to the simple, solid presence of one. The loneliness she lived with every day twisted into something sharper, a different kind of ache. An ache she had no right to feel. Think we've earned a rest, Reed said, straightening up and wiping his brow with the back of his arm. He looked toward the line of trees. That creek nearby looks inviting. Silver Creek, Margaret nodded. There's a good spot just past those cottonwoods. I can pack some lunch. They walked to the creek, the silence between them suddenly charged with a new tension. Or maybe she was just imagining it. Maybe her mind, starved for kindness, was now manufacturing suspicion as a defense. The water ran clear and cold over smooth gray stones. It was peaceful, deceptively so. They sat in the shade. Margaret laid out the bread and cheese she'd brought. This is a fine spot, Reed said, looking out over the water. But again, his eyes weren't just on the scenery. They were searching, measuring. Peaceful, Margaret agreed, her voice tight. Thomas and I, we used to come here on Sundays, before. She let the sentence die. I haven't been back in a while. Reed picked up a piece of cheese. Tell me about him if you don't mind. The request was another surprise. No one in town ever mentioned Thomas's name to her. It was like he had ceased to exist. He was kind, she said, the words feeling thin and inadequate. He had a temper. He was stubborn. But he was good to me. We were happy, I think. You think? Reed's question was soft, but it landed like a stone. Margaret looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. The last year was hard. The mine wasn't producing. He was desperate, working all hours, taking risks. She hesitated, then decided to tell him the rest. We were trying for a child. When it didn't happen, he took it as another failure, another sign he couldn't provide. Reed was quiet for a long moment. A man's worth isn't measured by what he pulls from the ground. Try telling that to a proud man, she said softly. And your first husband? Reed asked, his tone casual, too casual. James? We married young, back in Pennsylvania. A real smile touched her lips at the memory. He was so nervous when he proposed, he dropped the ring in a creek. He spent hours looking for it. Did he find it? No. He carved me one from a piece of birchwood instead. Her smile faded. He died of typhoid fever 6 weeks after our wedding. I still have the wooden ring. Reed's eyes held hers. You've loved deeply, Margaret Calloway. Yes, she whispered, and lost deeply, too. Perhaps that's why they fear you, Reed suggested, his voice thoughtful. You've faced the thing that terrifies them most, and you're still standing. It was a profound thought. But was it his? Or was it just a clever line designed to win her trust? To make her lower her guard? Before she could process it, the sound of horses and rough voices shattered the peace. A group of riders came around the bend. At the front was Frank Hollister, his face twisted in a permanent sneer. He was with two other miners from Thomas's crew. "Well, well, look what we have here," Frank called out, his voice dripping with venom. "The widow Calloway and her new friend, looking mighty comfortable." Reed got to his feet slowly. He didn't move aggressively, but he placed himself just slightly in front of Margaret. A living shield. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Reed said, his voice even. "Not sure gentleman is the word I'd use," Frank sneered, swinging down from his horse. "What do you call a man who spends his time alone with a grieving widow? Not 3 months after her husband's in the ground?" "I call him someone lending a neighborly hand," Reed replied, his calm a stark contrast to Frank's rage. "Something you might consider trying sometime." One of the other men laughed a high, wheezing laugh. "Oh, he's lending her a hand, all right." Margaret shot to her feet, anger a hot flash in her chest. "That's enough, Frank. Mr. Ramsey has been kind enough to help with repairs. Nothing more." Frank's eyes, small and mean, narrowed on her. "Thomas was my friend, Margaret. He deserves better than to have his memory disrespected like this." "Don't you dare speak to me about respecting Thomas," she shot back, her voice shaking with a fury she hadn't felt in years. "Where were you when I needed help with his burial, when I couldn't afford a headstone? Where were you when I sat alone in that cabin night after night, wondering how I was going to survive?" Frank actually looked away, a flicker of shame in his eyes. But his friends weren't so easily deterred. "Maybe she did for Thomas just like she did for the first one," one of them muttered, just loud enough to hear. "Convenient, ain't it? How they both end up dead, leaving her with everything." "Everything? What everything? An empty cabin and a mountain of debt?" But then Reed's posture changed. The easy calm vanished, replaced by something cold and hard, a stillness that was more threatening than any shout. "You'll want to take that back," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Or what, stranger?" the man challenged, taking a step forward. "You're just passing through. We live here. We know what she is." "And what exactly is that?" Reed's voice was pure ice. "Bad luck," the man spat. "At best. Something worse. At worst." Then Frank Hollister stepped forward again. He looked straight at Reed, ignoring Margaret completely. "You don't know what you're messing with, stranger. Thomas didn't just die in a cave-in." The air crackled. The birds in the cottonwoods went silent. "It wasn't just an accident," Frank said, his voice low and full of meaning. "He had help." Margaret felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. What was he saying? Frank's eyes bored into Reed. "And we think his pretty little widow knows more about it than she's letting on." Reed didn't flinch. He just stood there, a granite statue between her and them. But Margaret saw it, a flicker in his blue eyes. Not surprise, not shock. Recognition. It was as if Frank Hollister had just confirmed something Reed Ramsey already suspected. That's when the terrible truth hit her. He wasn't here to protect her. He was here to investigate her. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. The confrontation at the creek wasn't just a random act of cruelty from the town bullies. It was something else. An accusation. A threat. And Reed. Reed had stood there listening, his face a mask of calm, but his eyes were alive with calculation. He was piecing something together. "Mr. Ramsey, please," she said, her voice a thin whisper. She wasn't just trying to avoid a fight. She was trying to get away from him. Away from the sudden, terrifying realization that this kind stranger might be the most dangerous man she'd ever met. Reed glanced at her, then back at the miners. "You're right," he said, his voice smooth again. "It's not worth my time. These men clearly lack both decency and sense." He gathered their things with a swift efficiency. Shall we head back, Mrs. Calloway? He was playing a role, the chivalrous protector, and he was playing it for her benefit. As they walked away, their backs exposed, Frank Hollister shouted after them. "Town meeting tomorrow night, Margaret. You might want to be there, seeing as your situation is on the agenda." His situation. He meant the accusation he'd just made. They were going to put her on trial in front of the whole town. Reed waited until they were well out of earshot before he spoke. "What did he mean by that?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I don't know," she lied, her mind racing. She couldn't trust him. She couldn't trust anyone. "Nothing good, I imagine." When they reached her cabin, the air was thick with unspoken things. The pleasant morning felt like a lifetime ago. Margaret was trapped. The town thought she was a murderer, and this stranger, this handsome, helpful stranger, was a wolf in sheep's clothing. "I should go," Reed said, his eyes searching her face, trying to read her. "But I'll be at that town meeting tomorrow." "You don't have to do that," she said, her words a test. "I know," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "But I will anyway." After he left, Margaret didn't sit on her porch. She went inside and bolted the door. She leaned against it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She thought of Thomas. She tried to picture his face, his smile, but all she could see were Reed Ramsey's blue eyes, watching her, judging her, hunting her. Who was he? A lawman? A Pinkerton agent? A bounty hunter? Was there a price on her head? Why would anyone think Thomas's death was anything but a tragic accident? Unless it wasn't. The thought was a venomous snake, coiling in her gut. What if the town wasn't just superstitious? What if they knew something she didn't? What if Thomas, in his desperation, had gotten involved in something dangerous, something that had gotten him killed? And what if this town, this whole rotten town, was trying to pin it on her? The town meeting was held in the church, the only place in Silver Creek big enough to hold all the poison it contained. Margaret walked in, and a hush fell over the room. It was like the parting of the Red Sea, but with judgment instead of water. Every eye was on her. She took a seat in the back, alone, and scanned the crowded pews for Reed. He wasn't there. A cold knot of fear and, strangely, disappointment formed in her stomach. He'd said he would come. Had he gotten what he needed from her? Was he already on his way to a telegraph office, wiring some distant authority that the Black Widow of Silver Creek was ready to be taken? Mayor Harding, a man whose spine was made of jelly, called the meeting to order. They talked about road repairs. They talked about the 4th of July picnic. And then the mayor cleared his throat, a nervous, rattling sound. Now, to the matter of properties at risk of foreclosure. He mentioned the old Johnston place, the Taylor property, and then he paused, his eyes finding Margaret in the back row, and the Calloway homestead. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, stood up. He adjusted his spectacles, basking in the attention. He proposed that the town seize the 2 abandoned properties. Murmurs of agreement. Then he turned his attention to the main event. "As for the Calloway property," he said, his voice oozing false concern, "while it is still occupied, payment has been irregular since Mr. Calloway's unfortunate passing, given Mrs. Calloway's situation. I believe it would be in everyone's best interest if arrangements were made for her relocation." There it was, the polite, civilized way of running her out of town. Margaret stood up. Her legs were shaking, but she stood. "My situation, Mr. Abernathy? You mean my status as a widow? Is that why no one will hire me? Is that why I'm treated like a leper?" "Now, Margaret," the mayor began, "they think you're more than a leper, Mrs. Calloway. They think you're a killer." The voice came from the doorway, deep, calm, resolute. Reed Ramsey stood there, hat in hand. Every head in the church swiveled to face him. He walked down the aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and came to a stop right beside her. He wasn't just a protector now. He was an ally, or so it seemed. "I've been in this town less than a week," Reed said, his voice filling the church. "And I've heard this woman called cursed, a black widow and worse. I've seen her treated with a cruelty that should shame every single one of you." "This doesn't concern you, Ramsey," Abernathy snapped. "It concerns anyone with a conscience," Reed shot back. "Losing 2 husbands is a tragedy. It's not a crime." Frank Hollister jumped to his feet. "Easy for you to say. You weren't his friend. You weren't there." "There where, Mr. Hollister?" Reed's question was sharp, precise. "In the mine," Frank said, his voice dropping. "I was with Thomas when that tunnel collapsed. He shouldn't have been in that section. It was marked unstable." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. "What are you saying?" Frank wouldn't look at her. He looked at the floor. "He was desperate, Margaret. Taking risks. Said he needed a big strike to provide for you proper. So you're blaming me for his death?" Her voice shook with rage. "Because he loved me?" "No one's blaming you," the mayor said quickly, trying to smooth things over. "But you have to see how it looks. 2 dead husbands. People talk." "People should mind their own affairs," Reed cut in. He turned his attention back to Abernathy. "And as for Mrs. Calloway's mortgage, I'm prepared to cover her payments until she can arrange more permanent means." A collective gasp went through the room. Margaret stared at him, stunned. What was his game? Was this a trap? A way to make her indebted to him? To make her trust him? "And what claim do you have on this matter?" Abernathy demanded. "You're a stranger." "I'm a man who recognizes injustice when I see it," Reed said. His eyes swept the room again. "And I'm also a man with means enough to help where help is needed." But Margaret found her voice. She couldn't accept his help. It was a poisoned gift. "I don't need charity," she said, looking at Reed but speaking to the town. "What I need is a fair chance. You've made it impossible for me to survive here, and then you condemn me for failing." A strange thing happened then. A woman near the front, Mrs. Peterson, who ran the general store, shifted in her seat. I could use some help with inventory," she said, her voice hesitant. Then another voice. "I've got mending that needs doing. Fine work." And another and another. Small offers, tiny cracks in the wall of hatred that had surrounded her for months. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. But it was a start, a fragile, precarious start. The meeting broke up. People filed past her, some even nodding. It was Reed's doing. He had shamed them into a sliver of decency. Outside, in the cool night air, he was waiting for her. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "Just said what needed saying." He shrugged. "You offered to pay my mortgage. That's not nothing, Reed." "It would have been a loan." "A loan implies I could pay it back." "You will." His confidence in her was baffling and terrifying. He walked her home through the moonlit streets. The silence was heavy with questions she was too afraid to ask. "Who are you, Reed?" she finally asked as they reached her cabin. He stopped, turning to face her. His face was half in shadow, half in moonlight. His blue eyes seemed to glow in the dark. "I'm just a man passing through," he said, the same line he'd used before. But they both knew it was a lie. He tipped his hat. "Good night, Mrs. Calloway." As he walked away, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Tucked into his belt, mostly hidden by his coat, was the butt of a pistol. A Colt Peacemaker. It was worn, the grip smooth from years of use. This was not the gun of a simple drifter. It was the tool of a man who dealt in violence. She went inside, her mind a whirlwind. The town had offered her a lifeline, but she was now entangled with a man who was a walking, talking mystery. a man who carried a gun like he was born with it in his hand. She went to the small wooden chest where she kept her few treasures. She pushed aside Thomas's watch and her mother's locket. At the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of velvet, was the small birchwood ring James had carved for her. She unwrapped it, and her blood ran cold. It wasn't a simple, smooth band anymore. Someone had carved a symbol into it. A tiny, perfect star. The mark of a Texas Ranger. Reed hadn't just been in her cabin to eat a meal. He had gone through her things. He had found the most precious memory she had, and he had defiled it. He had left her a message. He wasn't just investigating her. He was marking her. The birchwood ring felt like a brand in her palm. The tiny carved star was a declaration of war. He knew. He must have known James. How? Why? James had died of a fever back east years ago. What possible connection could there be to a mine accident in Montana? It didn't make sense. None of it did. Unless everything she thought she knew was a lie. The next few weeks were a tightrope walk. Margaret took the job with Mrs. Peterson at the general store. She took in mending. She tutored the Garrett girl. She scraped together enough money to make a payment to the bank, a payment that felt like tribute to a king she despised. She was playing the part of the grateful widow, slowly being welcomed back into the fold. But every moment was a performance. She felt Reed's eyes on her constantly. He was working at the livery stable now, a perfect position to watch everyone who came and went from town. He would stop by the store to buy tobacco he never seemed to smoke. He would be there, leaning against a post, when she walked to and from her cabin. He wasn't threatening. He was just there. A constant, silent pressure. One Sunday after church, he approached her. "I was thinking of walking out to the creek," he said. "It's a fine day for it. Care to join me?" It was a test. The creek was where Frank had made his accusation, where the poison had first been spoken aloud. To go back there with Reed, it was walking into the lion's den. "I'd like that," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. They walked in silence for a while. The day was beautiful, a perfect spring afternoon that felt like a mockery of her fear. "You're doing well," Reed said. "Winning them over." "I'm surviving," she corrected him. "You're doing more than that. You're fighting back." They reached the spot where they had sat before. Reed stood looking at the water, his back to her. "James was your first husband," he said. It wasn't a question. Margaret's heart hammered. "Yes." "Typhoid fever, you said." "Yes." The lie felt like ash in her mouth. Reed turned around slowly. His blue eyes were not kind. They were piercing. "That's not what the report said. The report from the ranger who found his body." Margaret froze. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Reed took a step closer. "His name was Sergeant Davis. He was a friend of mine. He was found in a gully 20 miles outside of Laredo. He'd been shot in the back, but the local sheriff, a man on the payroll of a powerful rancher, ruled it an accident. Said he fell off his horse. Funny how often that happens to lawmen who get too close to the truth." Margaret couldn't breathe. "His name was James Davis?" "No," Reed said, his voice soft, but each word was a hammer blow. "His name was James Calloway. Your husband. He was a Texas Ranger, Margaret, working undercover. He was investigating a cattle-rustling ring run by a man named Abernathy." Abernathy. The name echoed in the peaceful clearing. Mr. Abernathy, the banker. The self-important, judgmental man who was trying to run her out of town. "He and his partners were getting rich stealing cattle and selling them to the army," Reed continued. "James got too close, so they had him killed. They paid off the local law, and they bought you a ticket as far away from Texas as you could get. They told you to keep your mouth shut if you wanted to stay healthy. They gave you a new story. Typhoid fever." The world tilted and spun. The memories, they weren't right. The sudden move, The whispered warnings from men she didn't know, the fear in her own heart that she had buried so deep she'd forgotten it was there. It was all a lie, a story she had been forced to tell herself to survive. Who are you?" she whispered. "My name is Reed Ramsey. I'm a captain with the Texas Rangers, and James Calloway was my partner. He was here to finish the job James had started. He was here for Abernathy." "Why didn't you just arrest him?" she asked, her mind reeling. "Because it's not just Abernathy. He had partners. And because the corruption runs deep. I needed proof. I needed to know who was involved. And I needed to know if the grieving widow was a victim or a part of the conspiracy." So that was it. The kindness, the help, the defense at the town meeting, it was all a test, to see if she would break, to see if she was guilty. "And what have you decided, Captain Ramsey?" she asked, her voice laced with ice. "I've decided," he said, his eyes searching hers, "that you've been living in a prison for a very long time, and I'm here to get you out." Suddenly another piece of the puzzle clicked into place, sharp and terrible. "Thomas," she breathed. "My second husband." Reed's face grew grim. "Abernathy brought in a new partner when he set up his operation here in Silver Creek. A man who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. The man who handles the muscle. Frank Hollister. Frank, the man who hated her so much. The man who had accused her of murder. Thomas was a good miner," Reed said. "Maybe too good. What if he wasn't just digging for silver? What if he stumbled onto something else? What if he found out what Abernathy and Hollister were really doing?" The mine wasn't just a mine. It was a front, a way to launder the money, or something worse. "They killed him," Margaret whispered. "The accident. It was no accident." "And they've been trying to pin it on you ever since," Reed finished. "The perfect scapegoat, the Black Widow. The woman so cursed men just dropped dead around her. Who would ever question it?" It was a brilliant plan, cruel and perfect. They had killed her husband and used her grief as the murder weapon. They had turned the entire town against her, making them all unwitting accomplices. "What do we do?" she asked. The fear was still there, but now it had a new companion, a cold, hard rage. "Abernathy keeps meticulous records," Reed said. "Everything is in a ledger he keeps in the safe in his bank office. I've seen it. I just haven't been able to get my hands on it." "The safe is in the vault," Margaret said, her mind working fast. "The vault is on a time lock. It's only open for 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour before closing." "And Abernathy is the only one with the combination," Reed added. "But—" He looked at her, a new respect in his eyes. "He has a wife who runs this town's social life, a wife who is planning the big 4th of July picnic." Margaret saw it then, the shape of his plan. "Mrs. Abernathy is vain. She loves to feel important. And I imagine she would be very flattered if the town's most respectable woman, a woman she herself helped redeem, offered to help her with the planning," Reed said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Perhaps from her own home. A home that might be empty for an hour or two while her husband is at the bank." It was a long shot, a dangerous, crazy, impossible long shot. "She hates me," Margaret said. "She hates the Black Widow," Reed corrected her. "But she might just love the woman who comes to her, humble and grateful, asking for a chance to contribute to the town that so generously saved her." He was asking her to walk back into the fire, to befriend the woman who had wished her dead, to play a part in a scheme that could get them both killed. "I'll do it," she said without a moment's hesitation. Because this wasn't just about justice for Thomas anymore. This was for James, and this was for her. The next morning, Margaret put on her plainest dress, pulled her hair back into a severe bun, and walked to the Abernathy house. It was the largest house in town, a 2-story monument to greed, painted a garish yellow. She knocked on the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Mrs. Abernathy herself answered, her face pinching into a mask of disapproval. "Mrs. Calloway, what do you want?" Margaret lowered her eyes, a perfect picture of humility. "Mrs. Abernathy, I came to thank you." The woman blinked, thrown off balance. "Thank me? For what?" "For speaking up at the meeting, for giving me a chance to prove myself. I know I have been a burden on this town, a reminder of sadness, but I want to contribute. I want to be a part of Silver Creek again." She took a deep breath. "I heard you were planning the Independence Day picnic. I know it's a lot of work. I wondered if you might allow me to assist you in some small way." She held her breath. Mrs. Abernathy stared at her, her small eyes narrowed in suspicion. For a long moment, she said nothing. Margaret could feel the entire plan teetering on the edge of a knife. Then a slow, smug smile spread across the banker's wife's face. Of course. The town pariah, the Black Widow, coming to her, begging for acceptance. It was a testament to her own power and influence. It was irresistible. "Very well, Mrs. Calloway," she said, her voice magnanimous. "I suppose I could find some tasks for you. Come in. We can discuss it over tea." Margaret had done it. She was inside. Over the next week, Margaret became Mrs. Abernathy's shadow. She ran errands. She addressed invitations. She listened endlessly to the woman's complaints about the price of bunting and the laziness of the other women on her committee. It was agonizing. But with every passing hour, she learned more. She learned the layout of the house. She learned that Mr. Abernathy kept a spare key to his office in the top drawer of his bedside table. And she learned that every Friday, without fail, Mrs. Abernathy went to visit her sister in the next town over, leaving the house empty from noon until well after the bank had closed. This was their chance. Reed met her in the dead of night, in the small copse of trees behind her cabin. "This Friday," she told him, her voice a low whisper. "She'll be gone all afternoon." "Good," Reed said. "That's the easy part. The hard part is the safe. Even with the key to his office, I can't get into the safe without the combination." "I know," Margaret said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "Abernathy is a creature of habit. He's also arrogant. He writes everything down." Reed took the paper and unfolded it. On it was a series of numbers. "How?" "His wife complains that he snores," Margaret said, a small, grim smile on her face. "She makes him sleep in the guest room sometimes. I was dusting in there. I found his travel journal under the mattress. He's written the combination on the inside back cover. I suppose he thinks no one would ever dare to look." Reed stared at her, a look of pure astonishment on his face. "Margaret Calloway, you would have made a damn fine ranger." The compliment warmed her more than she would have thought possible. Friday came. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a perfect day for a robbery. Margaret watched from the window of the general store as Mrs. Abernathy, dressed in her traveling best, climbed into her buggy and rode out of town. The clock on the wall ticked toward 3 o'clock. The final hour the bank would be open. Reed would be going in soon. Her job was to create a distraction. A big one. Something that would pull everyone, including Sheriff Doyle, to the other side of town and keep them there. She looked at the shelves of the general store. Canned goods, sacks of flour, and in the back, near the storeroom, several large tins of kerosene. It was a terrible idea. A dangerous, reckless idea. It was perfect. At 10 minutes to 3, Margaret walked calmly to the back of the store. Mrs. Peterson was busy with a customer up front. Margaret picked up a heavy crate of tinned peaches. She struggled with it, making a show of its weight. She carried it out the back door into the dusty alleyway that ran behind Main Street. The storeroom of the saloon was next door. Piles of empty boxes and old newspapers were stacked against the building. A tinderbox, just waiting for a spark. Her hands shook as she unscrewed the cap on a tin of kerosene. She poured the contents over the pile of trash, the smell sharp and acrid in the hot air. She took a deep breath. She struck a match. For a second, the flame wavered. Then it caught. Whoosh! The fire exploded to life, a hungry orange beast. Margaret didn't wait to watch it grow. She ran. She ran back through the alley, circled around, and came out on Main Street, a block down from the bank. She watched as the first wisps of smoke began to curl over the rooftops. A man on the street pointed. "Fire!" The cry was picked up by another and another. Suddenly the street was in chaos. People poured out of buildings. Sheriff Doyle came running out of his office, buckling his gun belt. The volunteer fire brigade, a disorganized group of men with more enthusiasm than equipment, began to assemble. The bait was set. Everyone was looking the other way. She glanced at the bank. The front door was closed. Reed was inside. Now all she could do was wait and pray. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The fire was raging now, thick black smoke billowing into the blue sky. The whole town was gathered, a frantic, shouting mob, trying to fight the blaze. No one was paying any attention to the bank. Then she saw him. Reed came out the front door of the bank. He moved calmly, not running. He looked like any other customer leaving after finishing his business. He held a leather satchel in one hand. The ledger. He walked down the street, away from the fire, away from the chaos. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod as he passed. He had it. They had it. But just as a wave of relief washed over her, the bank door opened again. Mr. Abernathy stood there. His face was pale, his mouth a thin line of fury. He looked at the fire, then his eyes scanned the crowd, searching. He knew it was a diversion. His eyes found Margaret. He didn't shout. He didn't point. He just stared at her. And in his eyes, she saw a promise of cold, swift revenge. Then he turned and looked down the street, in the direction Reed had gone, and he smiled. A chilling, triumphant smile. It was a trap. The whole thing had been a trap. The smile on Abernathy's face was the smile of a spider who had just watched the fly walk willingly into its parlor. Margaret's blood ran cold. He hadn't been fooled by the fire. He had been expecting it. He had been expecting them. Where was Reed? He had the ledger. He should have been on his horse and gone, but the livery stable was right next to the saloon, the very place that was now an inferno. His horse, his gear, his only way out of town, it was all trapped. Abernathy started walking toward her, his pace unhurried, confident. The chaos of the fire was the perfect cover for him. Sheriff Doyle was busy. The town was distracted. Anything could happen to the troublesome widow in the confusion. Margaret began to back away. Her mind raced. Reed was cut off. Abernathy was coming for her. And Frank Hollister. Where was Frank? He was Abernathy's muscle. He wouldn't be far. She scanned the crowd, her eyes darting through the smoke and panic. And then she saw him. Hollister was standing across the street, by the sheriff's office. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was looking down the alleyway where Reed had disappeared. He had a rifle in his hands. They were boxing Reed in. Margaret had to do something. She had to warn him. But how? Then she saw it. Sheriff Doyle was trying to organize the bucket brigade. He was shouting orders, but no one was listening. He was alone, a man of the law in a lawless moment. Margaret changed direction. She ran, not away from Abernathy, but toward the sheriff. "Sheriff!" she screamed, her voice raw with panic. "Sheriff Doyle!" He turned, his face red from the heat and frustration. "What is it, Mrs. Calloway? Can't you see I'm busy?" "It's Mr. Abernathy," she gasped, pointing back at the banker who had stopped, surprised by her move. "He started the fire. I saw him. He said he was tired of this town and wanted to watch it burn." The accusation was insane, ludicrous, but in the midst of the chaos, it was just another piece of madness. The sheriff stared at her. then at the respectable, portly banker. "That's preposterous!" Abernathy sputtered, his face turning a blotchy purple. "She's lying! She's the one who—" But Margaret didn't let him finish. "He was with Frank Hollister. They were planning something. Frank has a rifle." That got the sheriff's attention. A rifle in the middle of a fire was a recipe for disaster. "Hollister?" He scanned the crowd, his eyes finally landing on Frank, who was trying to look inconspicuous, the rifle partially hidden behind his leg. "Hollister!" the sheriff roared. "What are you doing with that firearm?" Frank froze like a deer in the lamplight. He had been caught. He looked at Abernathy for a signal, but the banker was too busy trying to defend himself against Margaret's wild claims. The moment of confusion was all Reed needed. He burst out of the far end of the alley, not on his horse but on the sheriff's big black gelding, which had been tied behind the jail. He had the leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He spurred the horse hard, galloping down the back street, heading out of town. Frank Hollister saw him. He panicked. He lifted the rifle, swinging it around to get a shot off. "He's getting away!" Frank yelled. But before he could fire, Sheriff Doyle was on him. The sheriff wasn't a young man, but he was big, and he moved with surprising speed. He slammed into Hollister, grabbing the rifle. The two men went down in a heap, wrestling in the dirt. Abernathy let out a roar of frustration. He had lost. The ledger was gone. Reed was gone. He turned his fury on the only person left. He lunged for Margaret, but he never reached her. A hand shot out and grabbed the front of his shirt, stopping him dead. It was Mrs. Abernathy. She had returned. Her fancy traveling dress was covered in soot, her face a mask of disbelief. She must have seen the smoke from the road and turned back. "Henry," she said, her voice a wounded whisper. "What is going on? What is this woman saying?" Abernathy tried to pull away, but his wife's grip was surprisingly strong. "She's insane, my dear, a hysterical widow. Then why did Frank Hollister have a rifle?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why was he aiming it at that man?" The fight was over. The trap had failed. Reed was gone. The evidence was safe. But Margaret was still here, alone, in a town full of people who had been Abernathy's pawns, and a cold, hard truth settled in her heart. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. In the aftermath of the fire, Silver Creek was a town stunned. The saloon was a smoking ruin, and the livery stable was badly damaged, but the fire had been contained. The immediate crisis was over, but a new, more dangerous one was just beginning. Sheriff Doyle, now thoroughly suspicious, had locked both Abernathy and Hollister in his jail cells. It was a temporary measure. Abernathy was a powerful man, and the sheriff had no real evidence against him, only Margaret's frantic, unbelievable accusation. The whole town was buzzing. Who had started the fire? Why did Frank Hollister have a rifle? And who was the stranger who had ridden out of town on the sheriff's own horse? Margaret was the center of the storm. She was taken to the sheriff's office for questioning. She told him everything. About James, about Thomas, about Reed Ramsey being a Texas Ranger. She left nothing out. The sheriff listened, his face grim. He was a simple man, not a brilliant detective, but he was an honest one. And Margaret's story, as wild as it sounded, had the ring of truth, especially now that Abernathy's actions had become so suspect. "A Texas Ranger," Doyle muttered, shaking his head. "In my town." He looked at Margaret, his eyes full of a new, grudging respect. "You've been through a hell of a lot, Mrs. Calloway." "It's not over, Sheriff," she said. "Reed has the ledger, but Abernathy won't confess. He'll hire lawyers. He'll say the ledger is a forgery. He'll say I'm a scorned woman looking for revenge." "He's right," the sheriff admitted. "Your word against his... It's not enough. We need something more. We need one of them to break." Their eyes met. They were both thinking the same thing. Frank Hollister. He was the weak link. He was the muscle, not the brains. If they could get to him, he might talk. But Abernathy knew that too. He would be doing everything in his power to keep Hollister quiet. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat in her cabin, the door bolted, a small pistol Reed had left for her on the table. He'd slipped it to her in the chaos of the fire, a silent promise that he would be back. Every sound outside made her jump. Was it the wind? Or was it one of Abernathy's men coming to silence her for good? The next day, a lawyer from Helena arrived on the morning stage, a slick, expensive-looking man. He went straight to the jail. An hour later, Abernathy was released. There wasn't enough evidence to hold him. He walked out onto Main Street, a smug look on his face. He was free. But Hollister was still in his cell. Abernathy had cut him loose. He was sacrificing his partner to save himself. Margaret saw her chance. She went to the jail. Sheriff Doyle let her in. Frank Hollister sat on his cot, his head in his hands. He looked like a broken man. "He left you, Frank," Margaret said, her voice quiet. She stood on the other side of the bars. "Abernathy walked out of here a free man. He's going to let you take the fall for all of it. The fire, the attempted murder, everything." Hollister looked up, his eyes full of despair. He promised me. He said he'd get me out." "He lied," Margaret said, "just like he lied to Thomas. Did you know Thomas was my friend, Frank? Before he started working for Abernathy, he was a good man. What did Abernathy promise him? A bigger share? Enough money to give me a better life?" Hollister flinched. "Thomas found out. He found the records for the stolen cattle. He was going to go to the law. Abernathy told me to take care of it, to make it look like an accident." His voice broke. "I didn't want to do it, Margaret. I swear. Thomas was my friend. But Abernathy, he has a way of making you do things you don't want to do. He said he'd expose my gambling debts. He said he'd ruin me." "He killed Thomas," Margaret said, her voice hard as steel. "And you helped him. And now he's going to let you hang for it." "What can I do?" Hollister whispered. "You can tell the truth," she said. "You can testify against him. Tell the sheriff everything you know. It's the only way you can save yourself." Frank Hollister broke. The whole ugly story came pouring out of him. The cattle rustling, the laundered money, the murder of Thomas Calloway. It was the confession they needed. Sheriff Doyle arrested Abernathy again that afternoon. This time, it was for good. The banker didn't smile as he was led back to his cell. He just stared at Margaret with eyes full of pure, unadulterated hatred. But the story wasn't over, because as the sheriff was locking Abernathy away, a telegram arrived. It was from the U.S. Marshals Service. It said that a Texas Ranger named Reed Ramsey was wanted for the murder of his commanding officer, and that he was considered armed and extremely dangerous. The telegram was a punch to the gut. Reed, a wanted man, a murderer. It couldn't be true. It had to be a lie. Another one of Abernathy's tricks. But the telegram was official. It had come from the marshals. Sheriff Doyle showed it to her, his face grim. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Mrs. Calloway. Was he using you? Was this whole thing just a way for him to get his hands on Abernathy's money?" The thought was poison. Had Reed's kindness been a lie? Had his story about being James's partner been a fabrication, a clever way to win her trust? Had he saved her from one monster only to reveal himself as another? No. Her heart screamed no. She thought of his eyes, the way he had looked at her. She thought of the risk he had taken. It couldn't all be a lie. "Where is he?" the sheriff asked. "Did he tell you where he was going?" "No," she said. But she knew. He would have gone to Helena to get the ledger into the hands of the territorial authorities. He was doing exactly what a lawman would do. "I have to form a posse," the sheriff said. "I have to go after him." "Wait," Margaret pleaded. "Let me go. Let me talk to him. If he's innocent, he'll come back with me. If he's guilty, then you can do what you have to do." It was a crazy request. But the sheriff looked at her, at the fire and determination in her eyes. He had seen what she was capable of. He owed her. "All right," he said. "You have 2 days. After that, I'm coming after him. And I won't be coming alone." Margaret rode out of Silver Creek on the best horse she could buy. She rode hard, pushing herself and the animal to the limit. She had to get to Helena before the posse. She had to get to Reed. She found him in a small hotel near the Territorial Capitol building. He was packing his saddlebags when she burst into the room. He looked up, and for a split second, she saw surprise and a flicker of something else in his eyes. Joy. Then his face became a mask again. "Margaret! What are you doing here?" She threw the crumpled telegram onto the bed. "They think you're a murderer, Reed. They think you killed your commanding officer." He looked at the telegram, his jaw tight. He didn't seem surprised. "I didn't kill him," he said, his voice flat. "Then who did?" "The same man who ran the cattle-rustling ring James was investigating," Reed said. "The same man whose corruption goes all the way to the top of the Ranger Service. My CO wasn't corrupt. He was getting too close to the truth, just like James was. So our boss, the man in charge of the whole district, had him killed. And he framed me for it." It was a conspiracy that went deeper than she could have ever imagined, from a small-time banker in Silver Creek all the way up to the highest levels of law enforcement in Texas. "So you ran," she said. "I ran," he agreed. "I ran so I could find the proof I needed to clear my name and take them all down. I followed Abernathy's trail here. The ledger was the key. It doesn't just link Abernathy and Hollister, it links them to the man in Texas, the man who ordered all these murders." He picked up the leather satchel. "I delivered it to the U.S. Marshal this morning. A man I trust. It's over, Margaret. The wheels of justice are finally turning." A wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. He was telling the truth. He was the man she believed him to be. "But they're coming for you, Reed," she said. "Sheriff Doyle and a posse. They'll be here by tomorrow." "I know," he said. He finished packing his bag. "I have to keep moving. Until the marshal has all the players in custody, I'm still a wanted man. It's not safe for me to stay here." He was leaving. Of course he was leaving. He had a battle to fight, a life to reclaim, a life that didn't include her. The realization was a cold, hard stone in her chest. He walked to the door, then paused. He turned back to her. "Margaret, what I said to you back at the creek, about James, about honoring you, all of it was true." He took a step toward her. "I came to Silver Creek looking for justice, but I found something else, something I wasn't expecting." His blue eyes held hers, and in them she saw a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "I know the timing is impossible, and I know I have no right to ask you for anything. But when this is over, if I'm still standing, I'm coming back for you." It wasn't a question. It was a promise. "You don't have to," she said, her voice shaking. "You'll be free. You can go anywhere. Do anything." "I know," he said, his voice a low growl. He closed the distance between them, cupping her face in his hands. "But the only place I want to be is with you." He kissed her then. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was fierce, desperate, a kiss full of all the unspoken words, all the danger, all the fear, and all the hope that had passed between them. It was a kiss that sealed a promise. When he broke away, he pressed his forehead against hers. "Wait for me," he whispered. Then he was gone. Margaret stood alone in the hotel room, the touch of his lips still burning on hers. She waited. She went back to Silver Creek, and she waited. Days turned into weeks. Frank Hollister was sentenced to prison for his role in Thomas's murder. Abernathy was transported to Helena to face a federal trial. The town slowly began to heal. They treated Margaret differently now. She wasn't the Black Widow anymore. She was a hero, the woman who had helped bring down the corrupt men who had been poisoning their town. But their respect felt hollow. The only thing she wanted was the sound of hoofbeats on the road, carrying the one man who had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. Summer faded into autumn. The leaves on the cottonwoods turned gold, and still there was no word. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to creep into her heart. Had he been caught? Had he been killed? Or had he simply forgotten her? Then, one crisp October afternoon, as she was sweeping the porch of her small cabin, she heard it. A single horse coming up the road. She looked up, and her heart stopped. It was Reed. He was thinner, more weathered than she remembered. But he was alive, and he was riding toward her. He swung down from his horse, his eyes never leaving her face. "It's over," he said. "They're all in custody. My name is cleared." He took a slow step toward her. "I told you I'd come back." "I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Margaret Calloway," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent the last few months thinking about what my life will be now that it's my own again. And I can't picture a single day of it without you in it." He dropped to one knee in the dust of her front yard. He held out his hand. In his palm was a simple silver ring. "Will you marry me?" She didn't have to think. She didn't have to hesitate. She had been living with the answer in her heart for months. "Yes," she said. "Yes. 1,000 times. Yes." He slipped the ring on her finger and rose to pull her into his arms. And as he held her, Margaret knew her story wasn't about loss anymore. It wasn't about being the death bride or the Black Widow. Her story, from this moment on, was about a Texas Ranger with eyes the color of a summer sky, a man who had walked through the fire to find her, a man who had honored her, a man who was, finally, home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because you never know what strange and twisted tale we'll uncover next.